The Florida Panthers are still waiting for their opponent, but we do know when game one for the second round will be.
You're Locked On Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into this Friday, May 3rd edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. I'm Armando Velez from the Hockey News. You can follow me on X at Monoman12. Follow the show account on X and Instagram at LO_FLA Panthers. And shout out to everydayers who come back here and get your daily Florida Panthers fix. Today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. This fast-paced game lets you team up with friends for tournaments to unlock awesome prizes like unique stickers for trading, cool playing pieces, and hilarious emojis for taunting your friends. So download Monopoly Go now, free on the Google Play or App Store. Game on. So, like I said at the top, it is a Friday night here, and we still do not have an opponent for the Florida Panthers. But great news is the fact that the Florida Panthers will open game one of the next round on Monday night, May 6th from Amerant Bank Arena. But joining me on this edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, it is a Fairbanks Friday edition of the show. It is a Fairbanks Friday night edition. So we had a Wednesday night edition with Jacob Winans and now a Friday night, a little different in the schedule this time of year, especially with the travel and, with the playoffs and our adult lives all at the same time. But Nick, thank you once again so much for joining me on the show, my friend.
No, thank you for, putting an audible on there and having us record tonight. If anything, it actually helps because we don't know who Florida is going to be playing on Monday. So we can actually go through a couple of things that, maybe Florida would be best matched up against or what might be their opportunities against the two teams that are still battling it out to play them on Monday.
Yeah, so thankfully we have that for now. Monday, and according to announcer schedules at announcers NHL on Twitter, looks like it's likely going to be 7 p.m. on ESPN. That's what the time is going to look like for that game, but still nothing official. But we just know that it's Monday. So, Nick, Charles Barkley on the NHL on TNT guaranteed that the Toronto Maple Leafs would come out with a win, and so they did against the Boston Bruins. And listen, I mean, the Boston Bruins, the first periods have been tough for them the last few games, as far as 5-on-5 getting shots on net too. And it's really these tough starts for them that have hurt them in late game situations that have gotten the Maple Leafs to get back in this series. David Pastrnak has been a ghost, and on the other side of the Toronto Maple Leafs, Willie Nylander scored twice on the night. Mitch Marner has stepped up later in the series. Max Domi is taking his opportunities too, but also with Boston, Jake DeBrusk is stepping up too. But also, this first round has a big opportunity for it to just end so well based on the slow start, because Washington and New York did not belong in the same stratosphere as their first round opponents. We saw Tampa Bay get one, but we saw how the depth for Florida and Tampa was too. And on the Western Conference side of things, I mean, low event hockey in the Nashville Vancouver series that just ended on Friday night too. I mean, Edmonton exposes a PK unit of LA that was one of the best in the league. Still questions on Pierre-Luc Dubois. Winnipeg gave up a lot of high danger chances to Connor Hellebuck, and in the Vegas Dallas series, road team has won every game except for Game 5, and Peter DeBoer has been switching up his lines, taking the Robertson, Pavelski, Hintz line away too. And I mean, this can end so well. I mean, we're recording in the middle of Dallas, Vegas right now as we speak, but man, what a great ending this first round is after such a sluggish start.
Definitely is, because what was it? Florida was up 3-0. Carolina was up 3-0. Pretty sure the Rangers were up 3-0. It just listen. The playoffs are meant to be a gauntlet, and it's supposed to be the best overall, playoffs in sports. or North American sports, I should say. And, you know, when you have these teams just rolling and winning three in a row and basically either sweeping or doing a gentleman's sweep, it's really not that fun for fans. You know, they want to see the drama. They want to see teams fighting back and forth for the games and everything. I mean, you know, look at us Panther fans right now. We were on the edge of our seats for 7 games in the first series last year, and, you know, we couldn't get enough of it. And then they went on a roll. So, drama makes the world go around for sure. So, Boston and Toronto is definitely living up to it. It'll be interesting to see who decides to step up or finally step up in that series. But then, you know, as we're talking now, Dallas and Vegas, you know, who knows if that'll go to 7 because you can never count the Golden Knights out.
No doubt. And also, one thing that I want to add on to the whole Boston Toronto series, I know I listed all of the similarities from a 3-1 lead that Boston had to now. And if you hadn't had
Mm-hmm.
if you have not had an opportunity to listen to that episode yet, please pause this real quick, go back to that episode and listen to everything that I said from games 1 through 6. Now that you have paused and listened to that, and now you get an opportunity to listen to this, what I'm about to say. How fitting would it be for the Leafs to score in overtime? Because last season in Game 7 on April 30th, when Carter Hagee scored that, it was by a player drafted by the Toronto Maple Leafs. So it will only be fitting if that is the situation that happens on Saturday night as the Bruins welcome in the Toronto Maple Leafs on ABC. And bonus points if it's a player drafted by Toronto too, for that one. So just crazy how history could possibly repeat itself. I still think Boston will end up winning. That's just my opinion. They're at home. I don't think you could blow. I want to believe that they won't blow 2-3-1 leads in consecutive years. But Jim Montgomery, he called out David Pastrnak in the media after Game 6. I mean, you're looking on the other side where Willie Nylander gets 2 goals on the night, including one that was off an icing where credit to Sheldon Keefe getting the personnel necessary to win a draw and get Willie Nylander to score one of the goals in the game too. And for a team that has had a little bit of turnover, which we'll discuss more in segment number 3, he's calling out David Pastrnak in the media, which he has no goals in the series too. So I can't imagine that David Pastrnak is going to be contained any longer. And that's why for Saturday, if I'm taking I'm not saying who I want, but I'm saying who I think will win. When your coach calls you out like that, you got to rise to the occasion.
That, or unfortunately, in my opinion, I think Jim Montgomery's kind of lost the room.
Maybe
You can't go through the seasons that they've had. I mean, they had the best record of all time in an NHL season, and then they go and lose 7 games in the first round of Florida. And now you're coming in, you purposely tank the last couple of games so that you play Toronto, and now you're getting what you deserve. To me, it's karma. And on top of that, I don't think he knows how to manage a series. I mean, last year was all about goaltenders and flip-flopping people out. I mean, Patrice Bergeron probably shouldn't have played in that first-round series last year. I mean, with how hurt he was. And now this year, he's, you know, flipping the lines, and it just doesn't seem like the team is, you know, gelling at all. They're just throwing the pucks wherever they want. Their passes aren't connecting. Seems like only Jake DeBrusk is here to play. And unfortunately, you know, as you said, Pastrnak hasn't showed up at all. I mean, you can tell that he's gripping his stick. He's trying to throw everything at the net, and it's just not going in like it used to. So, but I do have to give credit to Joseph Wall, who Panther fans saw last year during the playoffs. He won Game 4 and played very well in Game 5. I expect him to be at the top of his game as well. So, you know, I don't think Boston really has all the momentum here. I think they're on their heels, and you know, I never would have picked Toronto at the beginning of this series, but I'm with you. I mean, maybe take Boston, maybe if they score first, but I think Toronto has all the momentum right now.
Yeah, and by the way, it was 2 goals that Pastrnak scored that on the series, but with the center depth that we've talked about with Boston, Zaka Norcoil have scored in the series. too.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the one that I was mixing up. But still, the guys that you need as far as winning down the middle, I mean, you need those guys to step up and you need Pasta to take over. I mean, this guy was a 60-goal scorer last year. I mean, and there are storylines on both sides. If the Leafs take a step back, is Sheldon Keefe given the boot by Brad Treliving? Is Jim Montgomery going to is is Don Sweeney going to say that's 2-3-1 leads in a row for you? This can't happen anymore. So
Mm-hmm.
we will see. We definitely will see about that. But we're going to transition over to segment number 2, where we're going to discuss more about what the latest has been in the last 2 Panthers practices, and there is a specific player who is back with the Florida Panthers. We're going to discuss that and more here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. And it's winner take all season in the NBA and the NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any $5 bet. That's $150 in bets on spread, money line, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/locked on and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day long? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel, program free every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you the can't miss analysis, opinions, news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Back on this Friday, May 3rd edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Thank you once again for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day here on a Fairbanks Friday night edition of the show. So, Nick, it's pretty cool. Once again, not only the rest that we've been emphasizing with the Florida Panthers. So, just a little bit of a review of what the schedule for what the Panthers have that the Panthers have been on since clinching Game 5. So Tuesday, no practice nor media. Wednesday, media only. Thursday and Friday, practice. And tomorrow, the Panthers are taking the day off. So once again, it is a luxury for the Panthers to clinch the series so early. Also, even though Paul Maurice spoke about how it's harder for coaches because you are cutting 2 sets of videos, and one of them you might not be able to use because you don't know which opponent you're playing yet. So there's a lot of hours for those video coaches, something to consider there. But Montour and Ekblad did not practice on Thursday, but they did return to practice on Friday. Sam Bennett skated on his own both days, and Paul Maurice also said that Sam Bennett is dealing with a little bit of an illness, but also it's good that guys like Montour and Ekblad also get a lot of rest, because 2 guys who didn't really get a full training camp and preseason games, you got them resting a little bit. And Montour did take a big hit from Tanner Jeannot in the most recent game too. So that's another thing as far as like just trying to get everything cleaned up and get looked at with the trainers. But also Spencer Knight was called up too, now that the Charlotte Checkers season has been over. Evan Cormier not present. You could assume that he is back with the Florida Everblades too. So great to see Spencer Knight back, and also it's great to see that Montour and Ekblad were able to get some treatment to the side and eventually be back at practice. Oh, let me unmute you. There we go.
I think rest is probably the number one thing that this team needs. If you just look at last year's playoffs, they were beat up even after the first round. I mean, you had Ekblad that had issues, Montour that had issues, Bennett had continued to have issues. So
and still does.
And still does. I mean, I don't think that's ever not going to be the issue, unfortunately. But the fact is that they're going to be able to go into round 2 relatively healthy and, not beat up, and they'll be able to rest. So they're going to be ready no matter what. So it really does prepare them for the second round and whoever they're going to meet, whether it's going to be Boston, who's going to play more of a physical game, or if they're going to play Toronto, who has picked up their physical game but likes to play more of the finesse game and, the track meet. So Panthers will need everybody healthy, everybody skating very well, and just to meet both challenges. But, I will say this. Sam Bennett needs to get healthier sooner than later. I loved how Anton Lundell, team president here, was able to slot himself into that 2C spot with Tkachuk and really elevate his game. However, as the playoffs get deeper and deeper, I think they're going to need him more on the third line as a depth kind of guy to really start moving the goalpost, so to say, and really kind of take over games with Eetu Luostarinen and Evan Rodrigues.
Yeah, and also for the Panthers, they rolled the same lines that they did at the end of Game 5 too.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another thing when it when it comes to the lines that they have, Barkov with Tkachuk and Tarasenko, Lundell with Luostarinen and Reinhart too. So that's another thing when it comes to the lines that the Panthers are putting out there in practice too. So what do you think of the lines that they put out there for even though Paul Maurice did, it wasn't necessarily the Panthers. It wasn't necessarily in an emergency situation for Game 5, but it was just creating that spark and just saying, "Hey, let's end this tonight," and all. So, what do you think of continuing that, even if it isn't the lines that they started the series with?
Well, two things. One, I think it's great to have players gel with each other, or at least play with other players, so that in case that he has to mix up the lines again, that he has the ability to do that, and he knows who works well with who.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, if it's not broke, don't fix it. It won them a big game, and they scored their most goals out of the whole series in Game 5. So I mean, I understand there's two empty netters there, but still,
Mm-hmm.
the team put forward an effort. They didn't quit, and it seemed a little bit more balanced. So I think Paul is more or less just keeping those lines together to make sure that they are aware with each other. And on top of that, if Bennett can't start the series, then you already have your line mates ready.
Yeah, and full lines are Barkov, Tkachuk, Verhaeghe, Lundell, Luostarinen, and Reinhart, Rodriguez, Stenlund, Tarasenko, and then Cousins, Lawrence, and Okposo. Those were the lines at practice. So familiarity with guys. Lundell playing with Reinhart, something that's gone on for the last few years too. And it's interesting that if Bennett is healthy, and he hasn't even participated in rushes too, and with, I would assume that their next practice would be Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
But Paul Maurice does have that specific rule. He doesn't put a player in the lineup if he doesn't practice. He likes to give him at least one practice. So the all signs would point to one way or the other on Sunday if that is the case. So and you think about it, if Lundell is playing with Luostarinen and Reinhart in rushes in practice, we haven't seen much of Bennett and Tarasenko together too. So
Mm-hmm.
I would lean more on the side of he doesn't start the series too. I mean, he didn't start the Boston series last year too. He was inserted Game 2. It's funny because he got injured in the preseason this year and then returned against Boston this season too, in the first regular season game, and unfortunately went out in that first one too. So thanks after being tangled with Hampus Lindholm around the net too. So
Mm-hmm.
just this tells me that he's not going to start the series. I don't know if this gives you any sign of that.
I don't know because Paul likes to play things close to the vest. To be
No doubt.
honest, he said that he's only going to be out maybe a couple days. Now it's a week. Now he may be ready for the second round, or he may play in the second round. So this could be a week-to-week thing. This could be a multiple week-to-week thing. So we'll definitely see. But I will say this: whoever the Panthers decide to play, or whoever the Panthers end up playing on Monday. Uh, I think the Lions they have to stay where they are, and they have to be familiar, and they have to understand what their jobs are going to be. If it's going to be Boston, you're going to load up again, and you're going to be playing another heavy series. Play Toronto, then maybe you're going to mix them up earlier in the game to make sure that you guys have enough people that are going to play, a full 200-foot game instead of, playing the rush game. So, and I,
Yeah.
I had another point, but I can't quite remember it. If I remember it, I'll definitely speak up about it.
And like Paul Maurice, and remember, Paul Maurice said this a few weeks ago, how they're not trying to force things off the rush too. So we and based on neutral zone play, especially with Toronto speed, if you could just get some turnovers in the neutral zone, then that will definitely help with their rush chances, especially. But hey, Toronto has learned to play low scoring games in this postseason. So that's the difference between this season and last season from what we've seen. But that'll give us an opportunity to dig deeper, a little deeper into the matchups, because we got to fit two of them in one before we go into the weekend. So let's break down in the next segment the differences and the storylines and the personnel of both these teams. That the Panthers will play one of them, but let's see what the difference is between both of them from last year to this year. We're going to discuss that more here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. And all right, game off. We got to pause here to talk more about Monopoly Go. I know what you're saying. Flag on the play. You've already talked about that, but there's so much good stuff in this game. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with friends for timed tournaments where you can work together to build up each other's boards. The more you win together, the more prizes you unlock. There's so much to get. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton include their own unique mini games like digging for treasure or a robot pachinko machine. And there's always new timed events that help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go. So get off the bench and go download it now for free on the Google Play or the App Store. Game on. Segment number 3 here on this Friday, May 3rd edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Thank you once again for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day here on a Fairbanks Friday night edition of the show. So let's discuss more about the changes, the storylines for each team, because some of them need to provide more attention than others. And I think more about, we spoke about Charlie Coyle, Pavel Zacha not getting any goals, but that was the same unit that also was up 3-1 against the Panthers before they came back. And you spoke about how Bergeron maybe should not have played the series, a last-ditch effort as far as health and just trying to get that last cup. But also, one of the players who killed the Panthers in that series, despite losing, Tyler Bertuzzi, he's on the other side of things now with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Injuries with the Leafs. Austin Matthews, we don't even know if he's going to play Game 7. And if the Toronto Maple Leafs win, that thing is going to be tight to the vest, too. Don't want to make any speculation on an injury for Austin Matthews, but this time around, there's more trust in that on both sides. And yes, we're doing a 2-for-1 in this segment, talking about both teams. Joseph Woll, he would start the series against the Panthers, and there's faith lost in Ilya Samsonov. Yeah, we saw it in 2022. We saw him go through waivers this year and start the series, and look what happened. Woll has gotten them to a Game 7. He would start a series. Montgomery has learned a little bit about low scoring games, and also tried to do the rotation at first, but didn't. Jeremy Swayman got them there. And even in a Game 6, even though we talked about the similarities between the two series, that Game 6 for the Boston Bruins was still a low scoring one. It wasn't 7-5. So you're not even thinking about goalie change going into Game 7 with with Ullmark over Swayman this time around. Boston's power play is still hot in round 1 like it was last year. The Leafs power play has been cold, 1 for 20, I believe it is.
Mm-hmm.
But fully healthy, that's a top power play in the NHL. I mean, 3 of the 5 top power play units in the NHL were in the Eastern Conference in the playoffs: Tampa Bay, New York, and Toronto, too.
Mm-hmm.
And it's gone completely cold. And yeah, personnel has a lot to do with that, too. But also with Florida going up against them, even though they got swept by Boston in the regular season 0-2, Bob has started every game. There was splits between Bob and Stolars in the Toronto series, which Bob
Mm-hmm.
got pulled in the April 1st one, which the Panthers were on a little bit of a bad stretch. But for Florida, we saw how they ate the Toronto Maple Leafs' lunch money, but can't really judge that performance as they were trying to just consistently feed Austin Matthews for goal number 70. So I don't necessarily think that's 100% indicative of how the Maple Leafs are going to conduct their offense if Matthews is even healthy to begin with. So there's a lot of questions and still a lot of changes too with this. I mentioned Max Domi at the beginning of the episode too. He's stepped up for the Leafs too. And for Boston, it's a lot of the same guys who are
Mm-hmm.
back with the team. I mean, you add Morgan Geeky to the mix. JVR is there too. So that just a lot has changed between these two teams. But man, you think about the same some different storylines as low scoring games, man. But the Panthers, I mean, excuse me, for the Bruins, their inability to get the shots on net
Mm-hmm.
at 5-on-5 goes all the way back to games 81 and 82. And that's kind of where I'm looking at, and I'm thinking, man, the Florida Panthers could maybe feast a little bit on this. What are you thinking?
So I think with Toronto, I mean, their whole mantra coming into this season was to get tougher and to be harder to play against. And to be honest, during most of the season, they were still the same team. They had the same identity. Everything had to go through Matthews and Marner. Matthews almost scores 70. Marner's, almost has, he almost puts up 100 points. I think he did put up 100 points this year, or he was close. But it was really driving through those two. And then William Nylander finally got his contract, and then kind of nobody heard from him since, and until last night at least. But in the playoffs, you're seeing Tyler Bertuzzi, show his worth. I mean, he's just all over Brad Marchand and just creating a bunch of trouble for him. And then you have Morgan Riley, who I don't think gets talked about enough, and he's had a really good series. I mean, defensively, he's always keeping the pucks in. He's breaking up plays a lot, and he's part of the defensive core that's not allowing those shots to go through for the Boston Bruins. And you know, I think what Toronto's learning right now in this series is that they're going to have to play without Matthews, and they have to figure out a different identity. And this is probably really good for them. They don't have to force feed Matthews, or they don't always have to look for him. They can look for somebody else who may be wide open, or they could have a chance at somebody tipping the puck. It doesn't have to always go through Austin Matthews or Mitch Marner. So I think if they can learn to play without those two, or at least lean on those two most of the time, they'll be a much better team for it. Now, on Boston's side, as you said, not a lot of change. You have a lot of the same players from last year who are still kind of stewing about what happened. You know, they don't feel good about it. They won every single game against Florida. I mean, I'd like to say that was their playoffs against Florida. They got their aggression out. That's cool. But now they're fighting for their lives against a team that a lot of people predicted should have been done in 5 or 6 games. Now you're
Yeah.
here at 7. So I will say I do give my hats off to Montgomery for not switching out the goalies as he was, because Swayman by far is the better goalie out of the two right now. It's just Boston has to figure out what they're going to do, and is anybody going to step up? That's really what it is.
Yeah, and like we don't need to beat the dead horse more about what he said about David Pastrnak
No.
uh, in regard to after Game 6, but for the series, I mean, also the Panthers, I mean, when you think about especially in the neutral zone with the blue line, I mean, they really exposed someone like Jake McCabe last year too. I remember there was this one beautiful goal by Lundell, I believe, in Game 2, where McCabe got on a pinch, and then Lundell and Reinhart go on a breakaway too. And when you look at these lines that Paul Maurice has out, do you think that maybe there's a little bit of that Toronto series in mind for if they were to match up? And so what do you think about that?
So I believe Boston and Toronto have to look forward in case they do win of who their opponent's going to be in Florida, and if they keep tabs on who the lines are during practice, they're going to see Lundell, they're going to see Losterainen, and they're going to see Reinhart, a line that absolutely abused them last year. Then you have Kachuk, you have Barkov, and Verhaeghe. Ilya Samsonov is probably in a dark room with Verhaeghe's name stuck in his mind over the last couple of years. So for Toronto, not only is it getting over Boston and getting out of the first round and doing all that stuff to exercise their demons, now they have to exercise more demons against Florida, who just pantsed them. So I do think that, Toronto right now is just trying to play as heavy as they can to show that they can play that type of game and that they can take it to Florida. To be honest, I think that they're just trying to show that they can play with anybody.
Tight checking, lots of hits. I mean, as far as cumulative,
yes,
Boston and Toronto have the most hits combined in the first round. But obviously, you have to take in consideration the amount of games played compared to everyone else. But it's a not a lot of space out in the middle.
Who's
of the
number
ice
one?
too.
Who's the number 1 and 2 teams?
1 and 2 teams were Boston and Toronto, but before that it was Florida, Tampa Bay, right before that series before that series extended. So the physicality of just the Atlantic Division. I mean, this is the Panthers are on the hardest side of the bracket as far as like overall. Maybe not as far as maybe the top team. We still have a second round series to get to before we can officially judge it and look back. But based on what New York and Carolina faced in round 1, I can confidently say that the Atlantic side is definitely the harder side between the two. But
I will make a prediction for that. Whoever does come out of the Atlantic side will go to the Stanley Cup.
Oh,
I think they are more battle tested.
Okay. I a little bit of a hot take here on Fairbanks Friday, late night Fairbanks Friday night here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast here from Nick. But Nick, any last words before we get out of here, before we wrap this up on the night?
Stay humble. We're going to play whoever the Panthers are going to play. It is what it is. Let's just continue to go out and cheer for them. Let's show up on Monday. Let's sell out the crowd over 19,250. And let's make sure that whoever comes into our barn understands that it's ours and that this series is going to be the toughest one that they've had yet. So I will leave it with you.
And congratulations to Boston or Toronto, because after one of you guys get Game 7, you guys will get the Panthers. And also congratulations to the Florida Everblades on defeating the Orlando Solar Bears by a final score of 5-1 in Game 1 of the South Division Final. So big congratulations to the Everblades and for the growth of hockey in Florida. But Nick, thank you so much for joining me once again. You can follow him on X at Prudential0. And Nick, thank you so much, my friend, and I will see you next week.
See you next week.
And if you like what you're hearing, please subscribe to the podcast to be notified every single time the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast jumps into your podcast feed. Don't forget to also subscribe to the other shows on the Locked On NHL network, including Locked On NHL, Locked On Fantasy Hockey with Flip Livingstone and Steve Roden, and Locked On NHL Prospects. Thank you once again for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. So I'm Armando Velez with Nich Fairbanks, and you've been listening to the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day.